Hey everybody, how you doing? Hey everybody, how you doing? It's me again, Truth Teacher, and I'm coming at you with what will be a series of videos talking about this topic of the history of hip hop, right? Or who created hip hop? Because this thing that's going on social media right now is really getting ridiculous. And before I go any further, I want to make perfectly clear that this tension that's being stirred up between these ADOS and FBA people is complete nonsense. And I want everybody to understand that this group of people, they do not represent, nor do they speak for the African American community. These are a small bunch of people who have an agenda. I don't know what they think they have to gain from this, but honest to God, in my personal opinion, I think these people are agents who are being paid to sow confusion and discord amongst the communities of, non-European, predominantly descended people, you know? So there's this whole thing about who invented hip hop and talking about Jamaicans had nothing to do with it and Puerto Ricans had nothing to do with it. And a lot of people that are talking about this are people who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about because, number one, they're not from New York. They're not old enough, or if they are old enough, they were not in the Bronx at that time. And this thing that we call hip hop, let's be very clear where this started. It started in the Bronx. Okay, in different areas of Bronx, people will say that it was the South Bronx, but there were other areas of the Bronx. I mean, come on, because these people who created this music, they didn't just stay in one section. They were all over the Bronx. All right? So it was the South Bronx, it was Soundview, it was the west part of the Bronx over there, where you call that part, by a little bit up from High Bridge, where Roberto Clemente pool is, like over that side. You can look it up on the map if you don't know what I'm talking about. But it was all over the Bronx. Different people came from different places, but they all came together to party and to do events. So if you lived in the South Bronx, you would travel to another. If there was a party, you would travel to where the party was and do your thing. So people were moving all over the Bronx. Okay. Now, why am I emphasizing the Bronx? Because that's where it started. And even if you are from somewhere on the East Coast, I'm sorry, but if you were not in the Bronx, in the 70s, right, and the 80s, back up and have several seats because you don't know what you're talking about. You weren't there. You didn't experience it. You don't know what the dynamic and the demographics of that area was, or the social dynamics of the people living there. You don't know. All right? So if you're from the South, if you're from Louisiana or, New Orleans or Florida, you do not know what the hell you are talking about. Atlanta, no, you don't know what you're talking about. You needed to be living in the Bronx, okay? Now, for those of you, if you've never been there, the Bronx is a very urban area. It's not a suburban area. It's not spread out. It's a very concentrated area, very urban. Okay? except for maybe the northern part of the Bronx. Then it kind of gets a little bit suburban, kind of. And then you have like the northwestern corner, that's Riverdale. That's a whole other animal. Riverdale ain't had shit to do with this, okay? All right. There's no such thing in the Bronx as a neighborhood that only belongs to this one specific group of people or that specific group of people. With the exception, let me see. But even, well, okay, so there was one little pocket, I would say, like Little Italy. Arthur Avenue, it was predominantly Italian, but they ain't had nothing to do with the beginning of this. Okay? The rest of the Bronx was predominantly black and Puerto Rican, right? Back then, nobody was even talking about African American and Latino. Those terms did not exist. You were black or you were Puerto Rican, and if you were Puerto Rican on paper, the technical term they had was Hispanic. But the majority of the Hispanic people, the overwhelming majority, was Puerto Rican. Okay? That's what it was. You might have had a few Cubans, maybe a sprinkle at that time, and we're talking about now like the early to mid 70s, I would say, into the late 70s, overwhelmingly Puerto Rican. Towards the end of the 70s, you started having more Dominicans come in, and then by the 80s, you had a big, uptick in immigration of Dominicans, like the mid 80s, early to mid 80s. That was a big wave that came through. But before that, if you're talking about Hispanics, you're talking about Puerto Rican. That's it, okay? Now, me, where do I fit in this? I'm Jamaican by heritage. Everybody who knows me knows I'm first generation American. Both of my parents are Jamaican. I was born in Manhattan in Roosevelt Hospital. But my parents were living in Soundview at the time when I was born. And I grew up in Soundview, but then I moved to Jamaica. But where I lived in Soundview, that neighborhood was a lot of West Indians, right? There were African Americans too, but there were a lot of West Indians and Puerto Ricans. My neighbor on my right side was Cuban. They were like older people, so I didn't really mix with them. But my next door neighbors on my right side were Puerto Rican, and we lived in one of those like row houses where it's, brick house, but they're like townhouses. They're connected. If you're from the Bronx, you know what I'm talking about. And so, there was just a little gate between our house and the neighbor's house. We'd have the front porch, and, I would open the gate and go, and I'd spend a lot of time. So before I moved to Jamaica, my second language was Spanish. I was really becoming conversant in Spanish, and if I hadn't moved back to Jamaica, my second language, I would have been fluent in Spanish. So there was a very big Puerto Rican presence in the city. As a matter of fact, my mother and father met at a Tito Puente concert, right? I remember my aunt, she, she was listening to Calypso, she was listening to Jamaican music, she was also listening to, like mambo and all of that stuff. Salsa had not really developed yet, but it was that mix of Puerto Rican and Cuban, music. I remember those songs growing up, hearing that. That was my soundtrack. And I had my neighbors, next door neighbors. I remember that music. Those are the, the sounds that, bring my memories back. When I hear that stuff, it takes me back to my childhood, my earliest childhood. So I grew up in Jamaica, and I came back, it was 1976. So I came back in the mid 70s. At that time, my mother and father had separated. My mom was living on the concourse. She had remarried. We're living on the Grand Concourse on 172nd Street. The neighborhood there was predominantly African American and Puerto Rican. Jamaicans and West Indians, for the most part, they were on the other side of the Bronx, the White Plains Road, Gun Hill Road, you know, that area. Not so much where I was specifically, but that was the population. So you couldn't have one without the other. We all went to the same school together. We lived in the same buildings together. All right, so there was no such thing as the Puerto Rican side or the black side. No, we were all together. When you talked about it, it was black and Puerto Rican. It's like black and Puerto Rican went together like peanut butter and jelly. Black and Puerto Rican, black and Puerto Rican. That's why at Hunter College, where they have their ethnic studies department, they named it Black and Puerto Rican Studies, because those were the two biggest groups, and we interacted with each other. Yeah, I mean, there was, some people, of course, had like their little prejudices or whatever, and I mean, come on, you're going to find that everywhere you go. But there was a lot more interaction, right? We dated each other. We had babies with each other. We married each other. And understand now, when you're talking about overall, when you're talking about the black population, I would say a quarter of that black population was people from the English-speaking West Indies, the English-speaking Caribbean. But, okay, so I say 25%, but to be perfectly honest with you, it's really hard to draw a fast and clean line, because there's a lot of people who are, well, we call them African American today, right? But when you check, their pedigree, they had a father that was, from the Caribbean, or a grandparent from the Caribbean that came here way back when and married, an American woman, and they had kids. You had a lot of people that were half black, half Puerto Rican, half Jamaican, half Puerto Rican, half Trinidadian, half. You get it. You get it what I'm saying, right? So all of these people were together. And another thing, everybody's talking about hip hop this, hip hop that. Most of the people arguing about this don't even know what the fuck hip hop was or is. Okay, because hip hop is more than just music. Certainly more than just rap music. It was a culture. It was a subculture. So I hear all these people talking about hip hop is a black, this is an FBA culture. This is ADOS culture. Jamaicans, they got their culture. Why are they trying to tether onto our culture? Why are Puerto Ricans trying to tether onto our culture? What you don't understand is we all had our cultures in home. Nobody was trying to be anything that they weren't. When you were Jamaican, you went back home, your culture was there in your home. You're listening to your Jamaican music, you're eating your Jamaican food, you're speaking your patois and all that, and the same thing for all the other islands. The culture is in the home. Same thing with Puerto Ricans. They had their salsa music, they had their bomba plena. I mean, when you're outside, like the soundtrack of the Bronx, those congas. If y'all are from my generation, I was born in 1967. You know what I'm talking about, the Bronx and those congas. All right, that was the soundtrack of the Bronx, congas. So Puerto Ricans had their culture, they had their food, everything. African Americans, same thing. They had their gospel music, they had their R&B music, they had their food, right? Chitlins, collard greens, black-eyed peas, all of that stuff. Everybody that I knew, come summertime, they going where they going? Oh, I'm going down south to see my grandmother. I'm going down south to see my grandfather. I'm going down south, see my family. So everybody was connected to their culture. Everybody knew who they were. But in the streets, that's where we all came together. And this hip hop thing, you got to understand that this was a youth culture. This wasn't something that the grown-ups knew about. This ain't something that the grown-ups were into. This was what we did, the young people. This was a thing that we came together and we made with each other. This was a touchstone that we all had together. So in the home, we have all these separate things, but in the street, this is what belonged to us, right? That culture, that was what belonged to, yes, we were part of it too, but that was what our parents owned in the street. This is what we created, right? Because we weren't in Jamaica anymore. We weren't in Puerto Rico anymore. We were here in the Bronx. We were growing up in the Bronx in an urban environment. All right? You wasn't growing up in a rural area back down south. You wasn't growing up in the tropics in the Caribbean. We were in concrete jungle, dealing with the crime and the poverty and the fucked up housing, fucked up education, and all of the social pressures that we had to face in an economically depressed urban environment. We were all experiencing all of that together. And hip hop was something that we created to bring something positive into our lives. So what were the different elements of this thing? And once again, nobody was calling it hip hop. This was just the life that we lived. So you have the music, right? That was one element. And the music was the DJ. You had the DJ. And then you had, later on, at first there was no rappers, but number one, the DJ. And when you're talking about the music, the DJ was the most important. The DJ was more important than a rapper, right? Why? Because you can have a party without a rapper, but how the hell you gonna have a party without a DJ? You gotta have somebody to play the music. So the DJ was the most important person. All right? Later came the rapping. The next part of it was dancing. Now, people, when you say dancing, we think about break dancing. That was one development. Let me tell you what it was back then. Because this is something that doesn't exist in youth culture today. Back then, you had to know how to dance. If you didn't want to be a social outcast and that weird kid, you had to know how to dance. So every few months, a dance would come out, and it was very stylized. It had set patterns and foot patterns and all of that, and you had to know it. Because if you went to the dance and you didn't know how to dance, I mean, like, everybody's going to clown you. And even worse, God forbid, you show up at the party and you doing the old dance. It's a wrap. So you had to know the new dance. when the new dances came out. You had to know how to do the new dance. So every so often, you know, a new dance would come out. So you had the freak, you had the wop, the patty do, the snake, all these different things, all these different dance styles that we had. And then you had breakdancing. That was one of these dances that came out, you know? And initially, breakdancing, it had its time, and then, okay, that's all. But I'll get back to that. I'll come back to that another time. So, dancing was important. What else? You had art, graffiti art. That was important. That was a part of it. You had, what was the other part now? Okay, so we got the DJ, rapping, but that comes later. You had the dancing, which was the break dancing. You had the graffiti art, right? And, people would say like the fifth part of hip hop is knowledge. I disagree with that because, honest to God, like back then we was kids. Nobody was thinking about history or being woke or any shit like that. We just wanted to have a good time. We wanted to have fun. But the element for the youth culture, the fifth element, fashion. You had to know how to dress. Everybody had to know how to dress. God forbid you walk out your like the way people walking around now. You got these pants like capri pants all up over your ankles. Oh my God, no! You could not walk out your house and go to school. High waters. Oh my God, high waters can't be beat 24 inches off of your feet. High waters, so damn high. High waters, touch the sky. I mean, they would clown you. You would get clowned. So you had to know how to dress. That was a big part of it. So all these elements were part of this culture that came around. So now, who made this culture? All the people that were living there in the Bronx. These are all the young people who were living there. So we're all living in the same area. We're in the same neighborhoods. We're going to the same schools. Who put it all together? We all had a hand in putting it together. And at the time, once again, nobody was thinking that, oh, we're creating today this new thing and we're going to call it hip hop. No. It's something that developed organically. It just developed organically. Now, the soundtrack, the music, how did that part come about, right? The music that was being played. You got to remember, at this time, like back in the 50s, I guess, they would teach you in school how to play musical instruments. You would have band, right? But I guess eventually because of, by the time the early 70s rolled around, like, the city was in a real bad depression, So I guess funding got cut for band and stuff like that. So nobody was learning how to play instruments anymore. So, back in the 50s and the 60s, when you had a dance at school, they had a live band because the kids had learned how to play musical instruments. So they would play music at the dance. They would be, covering whatever was the popular music at the day. By the time the 70s roll around, that doesn't exist anymore. So if you want music and you don't know how to play a musical instrument, what are you going to do? What do you have available to you? Well, you got a record player or turntable, and you got your mother and your father's old Motown records and funk records and R&B and stuff like that. You got that. So that's what's being played at the party. What else is being played at the party? Disco music is being played at the party. What else is being played at the party? And I ain't never heard nobody talk about it, but I'm gonna tell you for certain. What else is being played at the party? Salsa was being played at the party. Why? Because damn near half the people there was Puerto Rican. That's why. Now, I don't know about other parts of the Bronx if reggae was being played or not because I wasn't living on that side, but where I was, definitely salsa was being played. So when you were dancing, you were doing, to the funk music or whatever, soul music. You were doing the dances, the popular dances that we created. You're doing your few steps here, few steps here, turn around, do this, do that. You were doing the hustle, right? Because that's what you did to disco music. You danced the hustle, and you were dancing salsa. That's what was happening, right? Now, going back to this thing about these dances that would come out every few months and stuff, this new dance came out, breakdancing, right? And when would we do the breakdancing? We would do the breakdancing when the DJ was spinning those funk songs and the percussion section came in. And then we would do a little dance. So, hold on a second. So, you got the beat. I'ma dance for you. Oh, God. I'm in my socks. I hope I don't fall and bust my ass. Ooh, let me turn on some lights. So, you got the percussion set. Doom, doom, da, doom, doom, da, doom, doom, da, doom, doom, da. And you start off like this, you're doing this stuff, and then you go down on the floor and you spin around and you do all of that stuff, right? And that was breakdancing. At that time, it wasn't anything big and complicated. It was really simple. You had a few moves that you would do down there. You would do like the, what do you call it? The windmill where, you're down there and you swing your leg around like that. We would, you'd have like, flips, somersaults and stuff like that. Then we had this one move we called the jackass where, you kick your legs up, in back of you like that. And then, the music changes and you get back up and, you do the regular dance, right? So what happened is you had DJs, what they started doing was extending that break. Or they would take the break, the breaks from several different songs and just, like splice them, mix them all together, right? The first one who did that was Cool Herc, who is Jamaican, right? So it's not that he was, we were playing Jamaican music at the party. Well, I guess if it was the area where the Jamaicans were at some point during the party, yeah, you would play some reggae music because the Jamaicans were there, right? But the music that we started using, for hip hop or what became hip hop was that R&B, funk, soul, Motown, all of that stuff, right? He started expanding that so that we could go down and, do our breakdancing, right? Cool Herc is Jamaican, we all know that. But it was another West Indian who figured out how to take, instead of having different songs and you editing them together or, you mixing them together, he figured out a way of taking the break from one particular song and extending it so that you would have a long period for everyone to dance on, right? That was Grandmaster Flash, who is Bajan. His background is Barbados, right? Now, the thing is that mixing, what else happened with that? The scratching. And creating rhythm on top of the rhythm of the song, doing that scratching. That's something that you don't hear in the music today. It doesn't exist anymore. But that was like the scratching. That was, I guess, if you want to say the turning point where something new was created, it was that. Because nobody was doing that before. Funk music, that was already there. Soul, all of that was already there. But that mixing, that scratching, that was something new. That became a musical genre in itself. That was new. And the scratching and extending the break, it allowed the dancers to dance on it, the b-boys and girls to dance on that. But it also gave a rhythm section, a longer rhythm section, right? For the rappers to rap over. So that's what was there. If we're talking about the music, right? And like I said, remember, hip hop is more than just the music, but right now we're talking about the music. And right from the very beginning, there was at least two West Indians that we know of. The music was African American. A lot of the DJs were African American. Nobody is disputing this. You know, I mean, these are conversations we never, this is some new shit. Nobody was ever talking about, oh, well, we did this and we did. No, we all did it together. And those of us who grew up there, who lived at that time, we all know this. We all know it. It's all y'all other people who are outside of the area that really don't know a damn thing, that are talking out the back of your neck like you was there. You weren't there and you don't know. So I'm going to leave it here for now. I just want to make those points clear. So let's just recap it, okay? Where this culture, this youth culture came from, it started in the Bronx. Who was living in the Bronx at that time? 50-50, just about African American or black, as we called it back then, black, and Puerto Rican. Who was going to the parties? Blacks and Puerto Ricans. And of that black, a subset of that black is English-speaking Caribbean people. What music was being played at the street jams, at the block parties? Funk, soul, Motown, disco, whatever other popular music was out there that you could dance on, and salsa. Usually at the end of the night, like towards the end, put on some salsa and people would be out there doing their salsa. We had dancing, right? Everybody, who knows who came up with these dances, but every so often we would have a particular dance that would come out. We would all do the dance because you got to show up at the party, you got to know how to do the dance. Okay, there wasn't really freestyle dancing then. It was all set. And one of the dance styles that came around was this thing that now we call breakdancing. But understand that breakdancing, just like all the other dance styles that came about, it had its period of time where it was popular. So, like I said, we had the freak, we had the patty do. The patty do was like, it's interesting because going back talking about breakdancing and where it came from again, what you got to understand is that things get recycled a lot. So giving an example with the dance that we call the patty do. Okay, so where would that come from? In the 1920s, it was the Charleston, you know. Then in the 60s, it became what? Mashed potatoes. And then in the 70s, it became the patty do. Breakdancing, there's always been athletic in dancing, going back to, the jazz age back in the 40s. You had the Lindy, you had the hop, the Lindy hop, and whatever it is they were doing back there. Yeah, so there were acrobatic elements in dancing back then. But the kids of the new generation, they took it and they put their own spin on it. And let me tell you something about, before I sign off, the dancing, right? Like I said, the break dancing, at first, the first version of it was very simple. And at a certain time, we all can say, oh, well, that's the old dance. What happened with breakdancing that was different is you had a certain group of people that they refused to let it go. They kept doing the breakdancing. And we would look at them, oh man, that shit is whack. Yo, that shit is tired, man. That's played out. That's old, like nobody's doing that no more. Who was the ones that was keeping that breakdancing going? It was the Puerto Ricans. The Puerto Ricans were the ones who kept the breakdancing going. And then in the 80s, it took off and became even more popular. It became more complex, right? Because they started adding in a lot of the really acrobatic moves when you're talking about that spinning on the hand, spinning on the head, spinning on the back. We didn't have all those elements in the breakdancing that we did in the 70s, in the late 70s. That wasn't a part of it. That didn't come in until the 80s. And who came up with those moves was the Puerto Ricans. So this whole thing that people are talking about, man, it's stupid to say that only one group of people contributed to this thing that we now call hip hop. It's really dumb. But I'm going to leave it there for today. I'll come back and talk about other aspects of this whole situation another time. But that's what I'm giving you all today. And once again, how do I know this? Because you're talking about the history of my life. All right? I grew up in the Bronx at that time. That is the time when I came back to this country. And I'm telling you what I saw and what I experienced. All right? This was not a Jamaican thing. This was not a Black American thing. This was not a Puerto Rican thing. Without all those three elements, this shit that we call in hip-hop now would not exist. Well, I don't know, they're calling it hip-hop. They really need to stop calling it hip-hop because they don't know what hip-hop is. Okay? Ain't nobody putting up, graffiti art like they used to be doing back in the day. I guess maybe they have a fashion, but it's not like all what it was back in the day when it created. It's become very commercialized, very corporate now. It's a whole different animal. And even the aspect of the music itself, that has had significant changes, but like I said, I'll talk about that another time. So just setting the groundwork for the history, we know that this was something that was created by the young people, all right? Our parents, whether they were Puerto Rican, Jamaican, or African American, what you got to know is the grown-ups was not feeling this shit. The scratching, oh my God, what the hell is that? All that noise. You see, you're ruining our records. What are you doing? Even the rapping. What the hell? That makes no sense. The hippity 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 hop. Maybe that's how it came up with that name hip hop, because you know the older generation were criticizing what's this hippity hop stuff. So maybe that's where the hip hop term came about. But like I said in the beginning, we didn't have no name for this. Nobody came up with that. Oh, we're starting something. No, it's something that just gradually evolved on its own. All these elements, you know, somebody has an idea and they put that. Oh, that's cool, man. Yo, let's do that. And then we build off of it. And then, you know, one important point to make before I go. This kind of stuff is not what you would hear. You did not hear this on the radio. It was not on records. The only place where this existed was in real time, in the streets, at a block party. Later on, they had, you know, specific nightclubs where DJs would do their thing. But, you know, at that time, I'm too goddamn young. Like, shit, like, I can't go to no nightclub, you know? But even that being the case, this was something that you had to experience in real time. There was no mixtapes. There was no records. None of that existed. And that's why the DJ was the most important element there. Because all of this was happening live. You had to be there to hear it, to understand it, to experience it. You couldn't can it. It was not commercialized. And from the DJ is the one that gave the foundation that allowed rapping to develop, to become what it did. Without the DJ, there would have been no rap. And the DJs were all ethnicities. They were African American DJs, they were Puerto Rican DJs, they were Jamaican DJs. We was all DJing. We was all playing that music because that was the popular music, that funk and all of that stuff, and the disco, all of that stuff. That's what we all listened to. That was the music. Like I said, at home, we all had our, you know, specific stuff going on, but in the street is what we created together. And that's the truth. So until I see you all the next time, love life, love, light, peace, prosperity, and perfect health to all of y'all. Peace.